about to meet Helen Crossley, who is head of audience insights and research at Facebook. As we sort of move into more and heavier mobile penetration, contextual experiences with our phones, consuming the majority of our content on our phones, I think there's a lot more deeper research into the visceral effects of that level of consumption. I fall asleep with my phone, I wake up with my phone, it's my best friend. So Helen's gonna speak deeper about some of these insights and some of the research they're doing at Facebook to determine sort of how this viewing of content mobily impacts people's neuroscience. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, and excited to be here and chat to you guys. I thought the morning speakers were really great, and some of the things that I'll be touching on today definitely could be common themes, I think, throughout the morning and definitely for the rest of the day. And as Arthur was saying, I run our team in audience research at Facebook. So essentially, our team is Facebook IQ. And, clicker issues. There's always got to be one person who has clicker issues. Oh no, we're good. Thank you. What Facebook IQ is all about is really what we found in the last few years is that we've got advertising clients coming to us as Facebook and saying, hey guys, the world is moving so fast. It's moving faster than our research teams, than our strategy teams are even able to keep up with. So given the fact that you guys are the ones who are driving a lot of that speed of change around mobile, around Oculus and some of the VR things that have been spoken about this morning, around all of these different technologies that are coming out to market, they said, you need to help us. Help us to understand what is happening in these areas, help us to understand the consumer behavior, how does this all work, what do we need to be doing? And so about a year or 18 months ago now, we set up the Facebook IQ group really to start answering those questions for our advertisers. And some of the things that we've answered so far, or the fun insights that we've found, have included a number of studies that have been around mobile. Oh. We still have clicker issues. Oh, okay. Should I swap to the other clicker below? No? I'll keep going, that's fine. So some of the studies that we've looked at so far have included things like where are we going with mobile, what's happening with mobile payments, how are people transacting on mobile, and the idea that you absolutely have to really be thinking about designing for the mobile device. And so we looked at a number of different things. So one of the things we found just recently and it's been published is think people, not devices. And that study was all about the fact that when we looked at mobile transactions, basket sizes on mobile were much, much smaller in aggregate overall than basket sizes on desktop. And I think that's a common issue that a lot of different companies are facing. How do I get my mobile basket sizes up? And what we found was actually the reason for that was not just that mobile isn't working well. What it was is that we have different people who are converting on mobile versus the people who convert on desktop. Different income, they're buying different things. It's absolutely just different experiences, different people. And so if you want to increase your mobile basket sizes, essentially what you need to be doing is thinking about what are all those frictions that are stopping someone from buying on mobile, breaking them down systematically, and that's what's going to increase basket sizes over time. We also released a study around parents on Facebook and understood that in actual fact, it's really interesting, new mums on Facebook, half of them have come online to Facebook by 7 in the morning. Their peak hour, where they over-index versus all other groups, 4 to 7 a.m. in the morning. And so it's this idea that feeding time is Facebook time, and how is that technology shift that we see happening with parents impacting parenting, impacting the way we think about raising our children. We also looked recently at a study around how people on mobile devices are fundamentally having a worse experience when it comes to buying a car. So people who are trying to buy a car primarily on their mobile phone, which is roughly 1 in 3 of our consumers, said that they find it 3 times harder to actually get the information they need. It's a ton more difficult to get what they want, and they're having a much worse experience. And that 1/3 of people who are shopping on mobile happen to be the fastest growing populations. It happens to be our millennials, our multicultural groups, it happens to be high income individuals. So there's some pretty big problems there that we need to help advertisers to understand and to solve and overcome. One of the other studies we've recently published, these have all been published in the last 6 months, and we do a lot of these types of studies, is around travel. And I thought that the best insight we found around travel was around this insight that your trip is as big as it is far. And what do I mean by that? It means that if I take two identical people and they're going to the same destination, one of them happens to be coming from across the country, far, far away, and one of them happens to live, maybe a couple of hours away. What happens is the person who's coming from further away has a much bigger trip. They spend more money, they spend more per day, they talk about it for a lot longer afterwards. Overall, that experience for them is a much bigger experience just for the fact that for them, they're traveling further. And we don't really know if that's because it's planning a bigger trip in general, or if there's something to do with the psychology of traveling further makes us want to be more invested in that trip overall. But I thought it was a really interesting insight. The next one that we've found recently is about how mobile is really about discovery and not search. So we've found that for the exact same amount of time that you spend on mobile versus desktop, you're searching 5 times less on mobile because it's all an in-app experience, right? You're not searching like you do on desktop. And also what we found, going back to the earlier morning presentations, is that for our younger generations, that's even more heightened. So for those guys, they're much more likely to just directly use apps, much, much more likely, and they're much more likely also to just directly type in whatever they're going for into the URL bar rather than searching for it. And the last one, this is the speed round of highlights of some of the work before we dive into one of the studies in particular, is about video, and it's a study that we released just yesterday, actually, at the ANA Multicultural Conference, which was all about the fact that video tells 1,000 stories. So if we think about pictures telling 1,000 words, it was all about the cultural connection people have between the videos they view online and what that says about their history, their culture, and how important that is to different multicultural groups throughout the US, that the videos they're watching are actually saying something about their culture. So for women, it was heavily into how-to videos. It was a lot about cooking, how to cook recipes that maybe they want to cook from their culture that they don't know how to cook. So all of these sorts of things and that cultural link that we see happening for those audiences. So that's kind of a summary of some of the things we've found in the last 6 months or so. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys today about in a bit more detail, because we don't have time to talk about all the studies that we've done, is one we did recently on neuro. Again, similar themes that you'll start seeing throughout the morning, which was all about the fact that we had advertisers coming to us and saying, hey guys, I understand how to market on TV. I understand what consumers are doing on TV. I understand how they're watching it. I have no idea what happens when they're watching that same content on mobile. And so we partnered with a company called SalesBrain to look at trying to help us answer these questions, trying to help us say, okay, how do people watch videos differently on their mobile phone to their desktop? And we didn't really go into it with a lot of expectations, actually. We didn't go into it thinking, oh, mobile's going to be awesome. We were thinking, well, we just need to understand as well what's different so we can help advertisers to navigate that space. And I think going into the study, a lot of us thought bigger screen, bigger impact, which is actually not what we found. I'll come to that though. So the study looked at a sample of 70 volunteer participants in the US. It was done with SalesBrain and Zest Labs in California. You might be thinking, 70? That's not very many people. Let me tell you a little bit about neuro before we keep going. So when we do neuroscience, and I'm not a neuroscientist, are there any neuroscientists in the room? Oh, one, damn. Keep me honest. But when we do neuro, what is essentially happening is we have a much smaller sample size because when we fill out surveys, when we do anything claimed, there's a couple of things happening. Number one, there are some people who just flat out lie, and so we need a bigger sample size to try and filter out, in our statistics for those people. Some people tell us what we think, or what they think we want to hear, what they think they want to project. There's a lot of things going on when we do sampling on surveys that mean we need a much larger survey sample than we would need for a neuroscience sample because the brain can't lie to us. It can't say, oh, I want you to think this. We're directly measuring the metrics that are coming through EEG, which is the funny brain cap, and through biometrics, which is sweat, heart rate, looking at pulse, and looking at the eye dilation, things like that. So the experimental design that we looked at was having two separate groups. One of them first viewed on TV, and they did a baseline kind of experience where we measured what are their metrics when they're not doing anything. They watched an intro to a TV show, so we told them that they were there really to watch the TV show, not to watch the ads. Very similar to anyone who's done any sort of copy testing research would know this kind of framework that we use. And then they watched the actual stimulus, which was the ads. And on mobile, essentially the same thing. So baseline measures, they were scrolling through a few stories in their Facebook newsfeed, and then they were seeing the video ads in newsfeed. And what did we find? So at a high level, what we found was that mobile actually performed really, really surprisingly well. So in terms of the things that you want to be doing a good job of, attention, approach motivation, lack of distraction, mobile actually outperformed TV. And when it came to some of these emotion and engagement metrics, where again we thought bigger screen, bigger impact, actually mobile and TV were on par. There was no real statistically significant difference there, which was really surprising actually. So I'll go into the details a little bit further. And what we found, so the attention measure was found to be 82% higher for an ad viewed on smartphone compared to a TV. So you're paying 82% more attention. And some of you might be thinking, well, okay, is that just because I have to squint to watch it? What's going on there? We'll talk a little bit more about what we think is happening in that scenario in a moment. But we also found that distraction was 79% lower on a smartphone screen. So what happens when we actually watch TV is that there's a perspective thing that's going on. So I need a volunteer from the back row. Back row volunteer, we've got one over here, perfect. Do you have a mobile phone with you? Yes. Silly question. What I would love for you to do is hold up your mobile phone in front of the screen here. Yeah, hold it up in front of your face, sideways, as if you're watching something on your phone. How many times, what's bigger here?
Same size.
Same size, exactly. So what we find is that we've got a weird dynamic here where the small screen, the mobile screen, is actually much less small than we think it is. The other funny thing that's going to be happening here is that while he's there holding up that mobile phone to his face, and if we'll pop it back up for a second. It's bigger. Yeah. And if I wanted to hold up a number of hands over here and saying, how many fingers am I holding up? When you've got that mobile phone in front of your face, it's like a horse with blinders, or I call it blinders. You call it blinkers? Blinkers, blinders? I'm Australian, sorry. Sometimes I mess up my words. But essentially, it's like your field of vision gets narrowed, and you've got much less things happening going on the periphery of your vision that are distracting you. And so that's what's really driving those attention and lack of distraction measures up for mobile, where there are much higher distraction levels for TV. The next one that we looked at is invoking engagement. So we found that overall engagement on both was roughly similar. But we did find a few interesting things. We found that the smartphone produced lower cognitive load versus TV. Big words, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that it's a good thing, it's a bad thing. So essentially, cognitive load is how hard your brain has to work to process the information that's coming at it. And you might be thinking, oh, awesome. If they're thinking really hard about my ad, isn't that a really good thing? No, it's a bad thing. When cognitive load is higher, what it actually means is that it's harder to process the information, your brain has to work much harder, it's less likely to recall, our problem-solving skills all decrease when our cognitive load has to go higher. And so what we find is that on mobile, what happens is that our brain is essentially taking shortcuts. So on a TV screen, if I'm looking at this, I'm going to see my source line, I'm going to look at all the things that are happening on the screen. Isn't it wonderful? If we're looking at this same thing on our mobile phone, our brain's going to take some shortcuts. We'll probably see this, we might read this, we're probably going to skip out a lot of the other information that's not as necessary. And so that's essentially decreasing our cognitive load, but it has some direct implications when it comes to creative. So what we found is that creative that's simple, has a maximum of 2 characters, nice big bright language, nice big bright themes going on, is much more effective on mobile screens as we measured it versus creative that's really designed for TV or movie screens. With a lot of characters, there's a lot of things going on. I have to keep track of all of the different things. There's text here, there's sound and music going on over there. That doesn't perform as well on mobile as something that's just simple, big, and bright, because our brain is taking shortcuts. The next one that we looked at was essentially emotional intensity. And this is the one that I actually find the most fascinating. So when we look at emotional intensity, what we find is there's no difference. So emotional intensity is looking at, okay, there's a lion coming at me. Do I think about, how excited am I getting? Is it making my pulse race? Yes. Is that happening in a good way or a bad way? If I'm just measuring pulse and pupil dilation, I don't know. Could be either. Could be very negative emotional or very positive emotional, but what we're measuring is how emotional are we getting when we view on the mobile screen versus on the TV screen. No difference. The next one, fascinating. The next one is approach motivation. So approach motivation is saying, okay, so the lion is coming at me. Do I want to run? Do I want to flee? Or do I want to go toward the lion, approach the lion? And when we approach the lion, approach motivation, essentially today, now that we don't have to deal with these things quite so much, is a proxy for positive emotion. And so what we found was that the exact same ad, exactly the same, when viewed on a mobile screen versus on a TV screen, we're more positive toward the exact same message on mobile, which we don't really know why that is. In full disclosure, we've not done a lot of research in this area. Neuromarketing is a new area. We don't have all the answers yet. So if you guys have answers, that's great. But we've got a few kind of hypotheses. So one of the hypotheses is just our phone is so personal to us. It is so deeply connected to us. So Arthur was saying he goes to bed with it, he wakes up with it. It's kind of like an extension of ourselves these days. So it could be that we're just transferring those positive emotions about the device that we actually have to the content that we're viewing on it as well. Another hypothesis that we have is something that's called our peripersonal space. So if you reach out and touch things around you, you feel less threatened by things that are living in your peripersonal space than things that live without it. Basically, if we're nice and close to something, our brain is saying, oh, that's not very threatening, we're all cool. And so it could be that there's a little bit of that going on as well. Although I think if we were to see that, probably that intensity of emotion score would be a little different than what we found. So the last thing that we looked at in this particular study was looking at message recall. And overall, there was no statistically significant difference in message recall on one device versus the other. There was an improvement when people saw on TV, then on mobile, versus the other way around. So mobile, then TV. TV, then mobile worked better. And so this is an area where we've said, okay, well, again, we don't quite know what's happening. Let's go find out more. And so we've been working for the last couple of months on a new study which looks into the effects of TV and mobile together and what that might be producing for us. So that was all the kind of hardcore neuroscience. Not really. Did I mess up? No? Yeah, go. I was going to say, questions, hit me.
Did you do a control experiment where you would give someone a mobile phone that wasn't theirs, so it wasn't in their space, wasn't familiar, and you compared that to the TV?
Actually, all of the phones were not their phones. So what happens, because we can only test one thing at a time, we can only change one variable because there's so much going on, as you would know, when you're trying to measure these things. So the phone was not their phone. The newsfeed was also not exactly their newsfeed. So it was a generic newsfeed. It could have been anyone, because if they had seen a story right beforehand that said that their boyfriend was out the night before with some girl that they didn't know, we didn't want that to be impacting on the results that we're actually trying to test for. So what we're finding is it was kind of generic newsfeed, a couple of news stories, a friend had a baby, the sorts of things that you guys see in your newsfeed every day, I'm sure, but it wasn't their phone. I think that's an interesting experiment as well. So this experiment was done with iPhone 6, so a reasonably large screen, but still significantly smaller than the TV screen that they did the exercise on. So it's more to be done, I would say. Cool. Any other questions on this or any of the other research that we've been doing for the last little while, or anything at all, challenges of doing this type of research? I'll give you a highlight. It's hiring. It's the biggest challenge. Yeah, we've got one at the back.
Does any of your research affect the question of whether there will be other than a like button on Facebook?
So looking at the new reactions information, so sorry, not sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, there are positive and negative reactions to some of these things. Thank you. Positive and negative reactions when you measure engagement and effect of piece of advertising. And did you measure both dimensions, both along the
positive
entire
and
axis?
in this
Because
particular
at the moment you only have a like button on Facebook,
Yeah.
and you even have to use the like button to say you don't like something. So I don't know what the like button even measures at this point.
Yeah, so we don't actually use the like button to measure. That's a good point. In this study, we did look at both positive and negative emotion. So a negative score on that approach motivation would have indicated negative emotion. To your point, so two things. So the first one is that we announced recently that we have moved from just having like to having reactions buttons, which go from like. I think there's also love. There's one that's just about empathy. So if something happens that's negative to a friend, you don't necessarily want to like that, but you want to show that you have empathy and you acknowledge it. So we have made some changes in that recently. But for Facebook, we don't actually use the like button to measure very much at all. So what we say to our advertisers is don't measure likes or any social metric whatsoever, measure your actual business results. So if you care about ROI, if you care about brand impact, if you care about shifting cars out of the lot, that's what you want to be measuring, not likes. For exactly that reason, actually. And even in our research where we're looking at more consumer behavior, consumer audience metrics, we also really don't use likes at all. We would occasionally index likes. So if we want to look at an engagement between two different groups, so if we want to look at men versus women and their interaction with a particular type of content. So for example, we did a study recently that looked at, okay, when you share a picture of a baby, what's actually going on? Because a lot of people say, there's so many babies in my newsfeed, what the? So what we found was that actually people are more likely to like baby photos versus other content, and within that, women more so than men. Now, the fact that women more than men, I think, is probably the more interesting part of that than that they like it overall. In general, though, the much better way to measure something like that is through looking at the sentiment of the comments, looking at different survey measures, using some of the AI techniques that have been discussed, which is what we would actually do.
But don't you want to measure dislike also?
So we would measure negative sentiment of comments. We don't want to measure dislike, because as soon as you put a dislike button up there, especially for younger audiences which are more vulnerable, it can be used as a measure to say that something is quite negative and it can impact the way our experience is on the actual platform. Right. So it's really a consumer experience, which is much more important than the research, the advertising, anything else that's going on. If you wanted to measure it for brand, you can also look at the X-out rate, which is people who are saying, I don't want to see this ad.
There you go.
You mentioned that emotional playback was just strong in mobile, right?
Yeah.
But then you said the stimuli actually exceeded, right? In the next point?
Sorry, say that.
On the slide, the next point on the slide said that the stimuli actually exceeded in mobile. Can you go into that and how
Yeah.
you define stimuli?
So the stimuli was the ads. So we had a whole range of ads
Right.
that we were testing. What we found is that the ads that were more simple, a more simple creative message essentially, and no more than 2 characters with a story, versus the ads which some of them had up to 10 characters in them. Those ones which were much more complex performed worse overall in the study on mobile than ones that were simple. Overall, though, taking all of the different creatives that we looked at, all of the different TVCs and mobile videos, overall, they all performed in aggregate better on mobile than in terms of positive emotion than they did on TV.
I see.
How does Facebook talk about the ethics of the neuromarketing research and experiments you guys are doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are some caveats in general for people who want to do neuro research. So ethics is definitely one of them. So group that we partnered with is actually an academic research firm, and so that's really important because in the world of neuro, there are definitely some not so great people that you don't want to be working with. It's a new space, and what we find is that there's a couple of issues with that. So there is a neuromarketing code of ethics, which our research approvals ethics board, goes through extensively before we do any of this type of research. In general, I think there's a few things to watch out for and a few things that the neuro industry has to have a think about. One of them is actually that there is no industry standard for neuro research of this kind. So in the way that if we talk about ad recall, you all know what ad recall is. It's a standard industry term. If I talk about audience numbers or time spent, there's IAB standards around these things. We can all talk the same language. In neuro, there is no standard. So I can go to two different firms, and whilst I'll get the same result, I won't have the same language to talk about it. And so it's really difficult in that regard to be able to come to any group and actually present results when one has a scale from 1 to 7, one has a percentage, one has this. It's super tough. But on the ethics front, I think working with people who have signed up to the Neuromarketing Code of Ethics is really important, as well as I do feel personally like some of the universities have a much stronger stance on those sorts of things. So we look at that as well as doing our own ethics and privacy research reviews of all of the companies that we work with.
So when you guys were doing this stuff and looking at ads, I guess one of the opportunities with mobile or owned channels is the fact that you don't have to stick within 30 seconds or a minute. You can do the Red Bull 4.5 minute, just beautiful cinematic piece that you watch. And so was there anything that came up? Did you guys look at any of the stuff when you have the branded content that kind of leaps outside that, we say, well, shoot, we can make like a 5-minute, just beautiful kind of branded piece that to cram the, everything in the first 10 seconds of it is like, we're just making, beauty for beauty's sake or whatever it is that has like a Red Bull logo on it?
So two things on that. The first one is that in terms of this study, we didn't have enough kind of variation in that to be able to come up with a definitive result. Directionally, the highest impact is within those first few seconds. Actually, you see a real spike in all of these measures in the first few seconds. The brain gets excited about the story it's about to hear, and then kind of it tapers off with a few spikes throughout, but not enough to be able to come to you and say, this is the answer. What we have done, however, is look at brand results across all of Facebook advertising. So every time we measure a brand impact, we take a test group who saw the ad, we take a control group who didn't, and we survey both of those groups to say, do you recall the ad? How do you feel about this brand? All of those types of brand measures. And what we found is that I think it's 74% of all of the brand impact, so that the lift in those metrics is coming from the first 10 seconds of the ad. So when it actually comes to brand measures, shorter seems to work just fine. Having said that, there's no disadvantage in making it longer. If you can get your message in the first 10 seconds and people want to watch more, that's fine. We're not charging extra for longer videos, so you may as well make the most of it. As long as you realize that those first few seconds are absolutely critical and people will probably drop off after, say, 10 or 15. If you want to make it go for 5 minutes, go for it. Cool. Got another question.
Have you looked at all how the content surrounding an ad might affect the result performance?
Yeah. It's a really good question that's been coming up a little bit for us lately. We have done a few bits and pieces around that. We haven't done a lot, but I think it's something that we probably will look into because I don't work just across Facebook, I work across all of the things that we have, so Instagram and the audience network and all of the different properties that we have. And I think it's a question that people are asking, particularly as it relates to audience network, which is where your ads are shown on other websites and other placements, how much that's happening. There have been some studies done which look at, for example, banner versus native. But I don't think any of them have actually had the exact same creative, because you can't, right? You can't have a native ad as a banner. It just doesn't work that way. So I feel like my hypothesis on it is that most of the difference is coming from the ad format and placement, not the content surrounding it. The content surrounding is really great for making sure your targeting is right, but if that's not a consideration, then I personally suspect that content is less important than the actual creative itself.
Do you look at the content that's like above a user's feed as like kind of priming them at all in turn like setting their emotional state before they receive the ad?
So we haven't done that yet. So that's the next thing that we're doing. So the next study that we're doing is looking at the priming effects, to your point, of seeing different ads before you see this ad. So I think it's a really rich territory, both in terms of priming as well as in terms of context and creation. I think we're out of time for questions. I'm getting the nod, yes, but come grab me at lunchtime or in the break if you have any other questions. I'm more than happy to answer whatever might be the burning question for you guys. Thanks.